Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. After a long time away, man, it feels so great to be back. I'm so thankful for what Jay Black, our producer, and Cody Chafin and Kaylee Manziel, folks you saw on camera, and the entire DawgNation team. So thankful for the work they did while I was gone. But, man, I am chomping at the bit to be back talking Georgia football after a lot of fun and some interesting things that have happened for me in the last couple of weeks. But, man, just so thrilled about the 2024 season that is here, and it is upon us. Now, let me give you one quick programming note. We're getting ready to get today's show started. Obviously, looking forward to everything we do on video, the normal show, and then the comments after that. I will tell you this. I've got one more sort of weird kind of personal thing away from work going on today, so we can't go long with comments. I'm going to try to keep the show a little shorter to make some room for comments at the end, but by tomorrow, we should be able to do a full-length comment section, do all that kind of stuff. It's just been kind of a weird time for me personally, so we're kind of getting some of that kind of stuff squared away, but I appreciate your patience there on that. But trust me when I tell you, we've got a fun, fully loaded show. The rah-rah stuff we have to deal with, of course we will, but plenty of other stuff in addition to that. So what do you say we get ready to get it started? After a long hiatus, it is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
It feels so good to be back doing the job that I love, talking to the people that I love, Georgia fans here, on the subject that I probably care about as much as anything in the world, that is Georgia football. Great to be with you here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. So thankful for the work that Kaylee and Cody, Jay, the entire DawgNation team has been doing, and just really glad to be back doing it myself here today. Now, obviously, we come back knowing we got to do the Rara Thomas stuff, and I promise you, I've got some takes on that here coming up, perhaps takes sure to make everybody mad, but we'll get to that here coming up in just a little bit. If you don't mind, though, since I'm in a good mood, happy to be back in the chair again, can we do something fun for a moment before we get to the Rara Thomas stuff? Hopefully you'll allow me to do that, although we'll certainly pay our full due diligence to the topic at hand on the other stuff here coming up in a moment. I've had a lot of time away, so that's a lot of time to think about stuff as it relates to Georgia football. And one of the things that I was thinking about, I believe it was SEC Media Days the other day that sort of caused me to think about this. If you really kind of pay attention to what might be the most significant moment in the Kirby Smart era today, you may have different answers, and perhaps your answer is more right than mine. But certainly one of the things you would have to very strongly consider there as perhaps the most significant thing to happen in the Kirby Smart era is that during a season, Georgia made a transition at quarterback from JT Daniels to Stetson Bennett, and in the midst of doing that, went on to win 2 national championships. And Georgia, made that look so easy that you could almost forget that it was actually far more difficult probably in reality than it appears to be in retrospect. In fact, some of the fan tension around that that you'll remember from that time probably speaks to just how challenging that was. Because if you want to go back to a previous SEC Media Days, 2021, we were kind of coming out of the pandemic at the time, probably wasn't a fully normal SEC Media Days. Georgia just sent 2 players that year. But nonetheless, one of those guys was JT Daniels. Daniels is sort of viewed to be the Heisman favorite and, all of the accolades, all of the talk. He was sort of the face of Georgia football at the time, despite the fact that he'd been a transfer and only played a little bit in 2020. He was sort of thought to be the face of Georgia football at the time, but because of some weirdness around some injuries, things like that, around the kind of middle-ish point of the season, it became obvious that JT just wasn't going to be Georgia's guy. Stetson Bennett became Georgia's guy, and the rest, of course, was history. In other words, this was an unforeseen circumstance. You never could have predicted this to be true, but when Georgia was forced to confront it, it had an option ready to deal with that adversity. And that is sort of the story of how Georgia became a 2-time national champion. Now, the relevance for that, for this year's team, I think should be obvious based on something that Kirby Smart talked about going back a couple of weeks ago, a comment that you've no doubt heard. Kirby kind of always has sort of a catchphrase that comes out of SEC Media Days. Perhaps you could say this was his catchphrase here for this year, a lesson that he says the Georgia team discovered as they studied the Nike organization. Now, he also kind of joked about the money that Phil Knight's sort of pumping into Dan Lanning's program there at Oregon right now, and obviously Lanning had a funny remark back towards that you maybe saw there as well. But putting all that aside, Kirby Smart, when he spoke to the media in Dallas a couple of weeks ago, said that he, his coaches, his players, they learned a lesson when they studied the Nike program, and it can be summed up in 2 words, something that Georgia put on display as it transitioned from JT Daniels back in 2021, and perhaps something that Georgia might have to put on display again here this year as well. This is what Kirby Smart said a couple of weeks ago.
The first things we studied was the belief of assume nothing. And I think that's so important in football. Because when you assume something, or you assume you know someone, or you assume that you know somebody's name that you're in the room with, you can take things for granted. It's just like starting over from a previous year. Assume nothing. Assume nothing. Start from ground zero and build this team different than every other team. And Nike did that. Nike followed that. They assumed nothing.
So that's Kirby Smart saying, hey, when you study one of the most successful corporate organizations in America, one of their mantras was assume nothing. Don't act like you've got everything figured out, because the world has a way of surprising you. He says that's what Nike has done well. Kirby Smart intimates that's what Georgia wants to do well also. And as I said before, that in 2021, that's an example of that from Georgia. We would have assumed at the beginning of the year that Georgia's fortunes as a team would have been tied to JT Daniels. He was getting all the accolades. He was taken to SEC Media Days as the sort of face of the organization, and yet by the halfway mark in the season, he stopped playing to never really play again, and it became Stetson Bennett who became the quarterback, and Bennett would go on to lead Georgia to 2 national championships. Obviously, none of us would have ever assumed that would happen, but that's how history played out for Georgia football. Now, what does this have to do here with 2024? Well, let me explain this way. Is that much the same way we see examples of surprises for Georgia in the past, we got to be on guard for more surprises for Georgia here this year, too. I just gave you a very positive example. Georgia kind of decided it really couldn't depend on JT Daniels because of an injury situation, so therefore moved on to somebody else, and it worked out really well. But sometimes the surprises and the possible assumptions you might make, sometimes they kind of turn out to be a little bit more negative than you would have assumed as well, too. In fact, let's go back to last year for a moment. I was actually kind of surprised to go back and look at this. It's not what I remembered. But did you know that in 2023, when you got together for SEC Media Days then, Georgia had 11 players. I was shocked to go back and see this. 11 players on the first team All-SEC list. 11 players on the first team All-SEC list. Perhaps you've heard me say this before, that I kind of view like your first team All-SEC level players, a little bit like your first-round draft picks, that sort of high-end, top-end talent. I sort of view that as a pretty good measuring stick of how much of a true championship contender you were. And on paper a year ago, we would have thought that not only is Georgia possibly a national champion, but there's a chance it's actually pretty easy for UGA because of all the sort of the top-end talent they had. You had Ladd McConkey, you had Brock Bowers, you had Amarius Mims, you had Tate Ratledge, Cedric Von Prine-Granger, Mikael Williams, Nazir Stackhouse, Jamon Dumas-Johnson, Malachi Starks, Kamari Laster, Javon Bullard. All of those players a year ago were predicted at the 2023 SEC Media Days to be first-team All-SEC players. But perhaps you remember, the majority of the players mentioned as possible first-team guys for Georgia a year ago predicted to be that, according to the preseason team, actually ended up not making first-team All-SEC. Brock Bowers did, Tate Ratledge did, Cedric Van Pran did, Malachi Starks did, but 7 of the other names I mentioned actually weren't on the actual first-team All-SEC when it was released at the end of the season. Assumptions we would have made about who was going to have huge years for Georgia, some of those projections and predictions turned out not to be true. Some of that was because of injuries such as Ladd McConkey. Some of that was, maybe a little bit more difficult to perhaps explain. Mikael Williams a year ago, for instance, probably didn't have the year we would assume that he would have. Some of that's sort of a combination of injury and other things. Some of the guys had good seasons, but maybe not as great of a sort of a season as they were projected to have. But we would have made assumptions about guys who could have stepped up for Georgia. And in some cases, those guys did not fully step up. the way we hoped they would as Georgia fans. And Georgia, therefore, perhaps because of that, came just a little bit short of winning last year's national championship, which brings us here to 2024. If you look at what's projected for Georgia here right now, once again, the preseason first team All-SEC. Georgia's got 6 names on the list here this year. You've got Carson Beck at quarterback. You've got Trevor Etienne. You've got Tate Ratledge once again. You've got Nazir Stackhouse once again. Mikael Williams, Malachi Starks once again there as well. But if history is our guide, if we're being honest here, that while all of those players have a chance to be first-team All-SEC, and maybe all of them will, if we were to assume it's a given that they'll all be there at the end of the year, where our assumptions are likely to be proven incorrect based on what previous years of Georgia football have told us. So what do you do about that if you're Georgia? And if you want to use the idea of assume nothing as a mantra that can guide your decisions and actions on the field and in preparation here this season, how does that shape you? I think here's what it comes down to. That if you go back and look at Georgia in 2021, when JT Daniels went down, or when JT Daniels wasn't quite adding up to what Georgia hoped he would add up to for 1,000 different reasons, Georgia just had another option. Now, the interesting and intriguing thing about that is the option that Georgia had is probably not one that it necessarily thought that it had. I don't think that anybody around the Georgia program assumed that Stetson Bennett could become what he became, but nonetheless, he proved to be an option in place for Georgia when the assumed option was not quite adding up because of injuries and everything else, not JT Daniels. Georgia was still in good hands with Stetson Bennett. So when you think about the assumptions we probably have about this year's Georgia team, not all those assumptions are going to turn out to be true. So do you have options in place when the assumptions fall short? That's really, I think, the big question that sort of sums up everything related to Georgia football. What happens when your expectations don't quite match reality? What happens when the guys you assume you're going to get big seasons from, either because of injury or because of something else, what happens when that doesn't quite fully work out the way that you think it's supposed to? Do you have other options in place? Now, the words we use to describe the other options is typically depth. And that's what's about to get measured by Georgia. Fall camp starts this week for UGA. Georgia getting to work on a grind of a schedule. We talked a lot about this, obviously, all throughout the year. It was a hot topic at SEC Media Days a few days ago there as well. Neutral site against Clemson, road games against Alabama, Texas, and Ole Miss. Sort of what has become kind of a reinvigorated rivalry with Tennessee. All of these games are really big for Georgia. And in all of these games, the depth is going to be put to the test, and the depth is going to be put on display. Because not every assumption we have about what Georgia can be here this season is going to be proven true. Some of the guys that we're hoping have great seasons, for whatever reason, be it injury or something else, they might just not quite fully put that together. But in the past, the best Georgia teams, national championship level Georgia teams, have had other options in place when some of the assumed options didn't quite work out. Does Georgia have that same level of depth here for this year? If it does, it could be on its way to winning a national championship once again. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and glad to be back with you once again. I tell you, I am so thankful to be doing a job that I love, and so thankful about all the stuff we get to talk about. Not all of it's great. Obviously, we'll do the Rara Thomas stuff here in a little bit. But, man, what a fun topic. What a fun season. So much interest and intrigue about the 2024 season, and we are all over it here today. Now, we could not be doing this if not for great sponsors. And I tell you, we love our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. I saw this thing the other day where our folks at Pella were, investing in a local school and really just being a great partner for a community. That's just what they're all about, right? And that same care they take to make sure they're good citizens in the communities where they live, they want to do that for you in the community where you live too. The home that you live in, perhaps it's your number one financial investment. It's certainly the number one emotional investment you probably have. It's the source of all your memories. And trust me, I'm thinking about that a lot here right now. And as you're thinking about all of that as well, keep in mind that when you want to feel good on the inside of your home and when you want your home to look good on the outside, Pella Window and Door of Georgia takes care of you in all of that. Better windows, better doors, more energy efficient, better looking. That's what they provide for you. So when it's time to upgrade, Pella Window and Door of Georgia is the place you want to go for all of that. You can go visit them at their Experience Center in Duluth. You can have them come out for a free in-home consultation where they're not going to pressure you towards anything, push you towards anything. They're simply going to educate you on what makes the Pella product better. And they'll talk to you about some special savings there as well between now and the end of the month. Just a few more days to take advantage of this prior to July 31st. You can buy 4 windows and get 1 free, or you can get 0% APR for the next 4 years there as well. So you got a lot of great savings options and a really great experience when you reach out to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Or you can find them online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. That's pellaofga.com/DawgNation. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. All right, so a lot of fun stuff here on tap. Can't wait for all of that. Jon Stinchcomb here in a couple of minutes. Really glad to talk to Jon. By the way, how great was the DawgNation Roundtable involving Jon and Terrence, Jake Fromm, a great collection of former Georgia players. If you hadn't seen that on the DawgNation YouTube page, you need to go back and see that archived there. Tremendous, tremendous stuff. We'll talk to Jon live here coming up in a moment. Prior to that, though, a lot more of a serious topic to discuss here as we go around the doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. I love Dr. Pepper, but I don't necessarily love today's content for Around the Doghouse, poured by Dr. Pepper. Obviously, Rara Thomas, the Georgia wide receiver, now we're told suspended indefinitely because of a legal entanglement that feels very similar to something that Rara dealt with a year ago. Let me make sure I get my facts right on this. So let's read specifically from Connor Riley's report from DawgNation.com. Connor writes, the Georgia wide receiver Rara Thomas arrested Friday morning, charged with 1 count of cruelty to children, which is a felony, and 2 counts of battery, both of which are misdemeanors. All the charges carry what's called a family violence tag. Booked into the Athens-Clarke County Jail 3:20 a.m. on Friday, still awaiting bond as of mid-morning Friday. And I can tell you, according to people that I talked to before the show began today, my understanding is, as of the time we went on the air, that Thomas was believed to still be incarcerated, waiting for, I guess, the next legal step in all of this. But my understanding is, as of Monday morning, Thomas was still in jail. DawgNation goes on to report, this is Connor Riley writing, not the first time Thomas has been arrested on a family violence charge during his time in Georgia. In January of 2023, just after having arrived from Mississippi State, Thomas was arrested on a misdemeanor count of family violence and a felony count of false imprisonment. Both of those charges eventually were dropped, with Thomas entering a pretrial diversion program. He also was required to complete an anger management work and community service as a part of the deal. That is how this has been reported at DawgNation.com. So the one thing you've probably noticed if you're a Georgia fan, and obviously Georgia fans are going to be a little sensitive to this, is that there's a lot of talk right now about the so-called culture at Georgia. And you got this going on. You've got the player, the traffic instances, which seems to be, sort of a reoccurring problem for Georgia. People sort of add that together and they say something to the effect of, what's wrong with the culture at UGA? And listen, it's not my intention to mock that as a question or anything like that. I think that the situation involving Rara here is probably serious enough that taking a question like that seriously probably makes some sense. But if I give you kind of my full answer on this, just to be completely honest, I'm guessing that my opinion's probably not the kind of – this is one of the reasons why we kind of only talk about football, because if I talk about things that are not football long enough, I promise I'll make everybody mad. Perhaps there's a little bit of an example of this here too. So let me give you kind of a few thoughts on the Rara situation and sort of the idea of the Georgia culture overall. Here's my first opinion. I don't believe that anybody outside of kind of a sports media context would link what Rara is accused of doing with the sort of reckless driving stuff that Georgia has also been dealing with. I don't think they're in a similar silo really at all. Now, it kind of gets lumped together because it's quote-unquote player arrest, but the Rara situation, that allegation, because it involves an actual allegation of violence, I view that as a far different thing than most of the traffic stuff we've heard about related to Georgia. And I'll kind of give you a for instance as to why. I've got 2 kids. Let's deal with my son because he'll be driving first. And, He's the older of my two kids. And also, let's just be honest here. If there's one that's going to drive recklessly, actuarial tables would tell us it's the son who's most likely to do that. So if he were to be 16, 17, 18, 19 years old and driving too recklessly, I can tell you this, I hope he does get arrested. In that particular case, the police are doing me a favor. They are helping police the roads, keep him safe, the same way I want police keeping me safe from other drivers. If my son is out there driving too fast in the event that one day he were to, the best thing I believe that could happen is for him to get arrested for that, because that prevents something worse from happening. And in that particular case, I just sort of view law enforcement as doing me a favor. It may cost me some money or him some money in the form of a ticket and a fine, things like that. But in that particular case, thank goodness that law enforcement was there to police against bad behavior that could result in an even worse outcome if it were to go unchecked. Obviously, I wouldn't, and nor would you, think anything like that when it comes to the Rara Thomas situation. These are serious allegations, even if we don't quite fully understand the nature of all of them. But you wouldn't want anyone you know, certainly yourself or a close family member, to be involved with that there at all. They're just completely different situations, much more serious, much more significant when it comes to the rah-rah thing than most of the traffic stuff we've heard of Georgia being accused of. It's one of the reasons why you've heard me say this before. Maybe not everybody understands this, but for the most part, I don't really believe in the idea of PR and public relations. I don't think the notion of, oh, that's a bad look for UGA. I don't believe that's the kind of thing that you can point to on the elemental chart. When you close your eyes, I don't know that even exists really at all. It's just sort of a thing that people talk about, and people are going to talk, of course, no matter what. But the notion that Georgia's confronting a public relations battle on this, for the most part, I'm not really quite so sure that's true. Now, the other thing that people will say is, yeah, but if Rah-Rah did what he's accused of doing, he's going to be punished. Well, as I said before, I mean, my understanding is, and perhaps I've got my facts wrong on this, my understanding is Rah-Rah, as of Monday morning, was still in jail. Like, that may not be the full punishment he gets if he's guilty of what he's, accused of doing here, but he is certainly facing some legal ramifications just for the accusation here right now. So it's hard to imagine that he's not feeling some sort of consequence for all of this, and perhaps if he's guilty, he'll feel even more, but it's certainly thus far not an example of him getting off scot-free, even for the accusation, because, as I said before, he is, to my understanding, and has been still incarcerated. Perhaps that ends today. Here is, though, where we kind of get into probably an area in which my opinion is just a good bit different than a lot of other people's when it relates to stuff like this, although I make no apologies for the way that I feel on this. As said before, I'm worried about specific actions. I'm not worried about public relations at all. So let's take Rah-Rah out of this for a moment and the specific thing he's accused of. And let's just sort of view this as sort of like generic bad behavior from kind of a generic unnamed player. Here's the thing that I believe. And as I said before, I would say probably the majority of people disagree with this. I think maybe anyway. But that doesn't change my viewpoint that I'm probably right. I would take football away from a player as a last resort. That when there's bad behavior, when there's an accusation of wrongdoing, I would take football away from a player as a last resort. Now, people who hear this, who are either not Georgia fans or whatever else, they may say in response to me, well, of course you'd say that, B.A. You're a Georgia fan. You just want Georgia to win. You're win at all costs. You don't care about anything else but just winning football games. I can understand why you might say that. But if you've been with us for a long time, hopefully you can back me up on this. Not only do I feel this way about Georgia, I feel this way about pretty much every team. SEC rivals like Florida, Alabama, Auburn. I mean, if you're really with us for a long time, when have you ever heard me railing on them for, what's going on with the culture at blah, blah, blah? Like back in remember the early days of the college football blogosphere? Do you remember that time back when there was the Fulmer Cup for the accusation was Tennessee had players who were getting in trouble. Therefore, if you got arrested, you were competing in the Fulmer Cup standings. We've never done anything like that around here. We're not heavy-handed in that particular regard. We just think that football should be taken away from a player as an absolute last resort because, for the most part, football makes men. And if a player is dealing with, whatever, is that football player's life going to be made better if the opportunity to have the change agent like football a part of his life, is that going to make him better? And we would say in most cases, no, not just for players at Georgia, but players all across college football. We're not really heavy-handed asking, coaches to be punished, the judge, jury, and, so-called executioner and stuff like this. We think that's primarily the job for law enforcement. We just don't go around saying, what is so-and-so coach going to do about so-and-so bad behavior? Not just for Georgia, but for everybody else. We just don't do that kind of thing. However, when it comes to Rara Thomas, based on the limited information that I have, not knowing all the facts, just making an assumption from kind of 10,000 feet, if I was Kirby Smart, I would probably dismiss him. Because in this particular case, it sort of looks like an example of perhaps making the same mistake twice, or the same problematic situation entering into that twice. Maybe that's sort of saying that the right way. And perhaps when Rara gets his day in court, he'll defend himself, and we'll find out that the facts are far different. They've been sort of described as of now. But the way they've been described as of now, this at least rhymes with what Rara had going on in January 2023. And because it has the viewpoint of almost being the same thing twice, I'd probably move on if I was Georgia. But that doesn't change my belief that in most situations, I think coaches would do right by their players to keep them a part of the program as long as they possibly can, to not take football away from them just because you're worried about the so-called bad look and the potential PR problem that it causes. I don't think that's fair to players, whether that's a player at Georgia or a player anywhere else. And this is obviously probably not the last time we'll talk about this as it relates to Georgia or as it relates to another program. And obviously there's a lot of room for disagreement about these kinds of things. I totally understand that. But that's my opinion. In Georgia's case with Rara, might be the right thing to move on. But in most cases, I'd like to see coaches, whether it's at Georgia or anywhere else, try their best to keep a player involved in the program. Because if he's making bad decisions and if he's doing bad things, then all the more reason that football can be a chance to make, better decisions in the future. At least that's what I would hope would be the case. Complicated situation here, and obviously something a lot of folks are talking about here this weekend. And that is Around the Doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. Now, as sort of not fun as all that is, I can promise you what is fun is our friends at Dr. Pepper. So I can tell you this. So yesterday we were away from the house, and we were kind of doing all kinds of stuff. We've had a lot going on. And I was driving down the road, and I was so thirsty. And so I had to stop and said, I got to get something to drink. And so went in the store and came back out with a nice ice. For me, it was a bottle. It was a bottle of Diet Dr. Pepper. Man, I enjoyed every drop of that. It tasted so good. There's nothing better than that sort of refreshing beverage, like right when you need it. And I know for many of you this summer, it's not just been like the Dr. Pepper that you're used to. It's also the brand new offering from Dr. Pepper, the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. For pool day and things like that, this sort of taste of summer is the perfect thing. And I know our friends from Dr. Pepper have had a great time rolling all of that out. Everybody's having a good time with this here right now. So as you're shopping at your local Kroger or wherever you're doing your shopping, make sure you check out Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar, a great new limited time offering from our friends at Dr. Pepper. So much fun, and of course, great to have them as a part of Around the Doghouse here today. All right, so enough from me. I've gone very long. I guess that was perhaps to be expected. First time back in the saddle here for a little while. But without further ado, don't want to keep our next guest waiting. Really good stuff coming from Jon Stinchcomb, who always has such a measured take on issues such as this. So let's do that right now. Jon Stinchcomb, the former Georgia All-American, as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
I apologize for being late to Jon, but I do want to get right into that with him. Jon, unfortunately, we're talking, at least right now, but the Rara Thomas situation, complicated. A lot of people are going to have different takes there on that. As I said before, if I talk long enough about stuff like this, I'm sure I'll make everybody mad, at least in some, particular way. But my take that I expressed a moment ago was, listen, I don't like taking football away from players. I'm very, very slow to want to do that at Georgia or Alabama or anywhere else. That's just kind of my viewpoint there on that. But in the case of Rara, unless we find out some facts that make this feel very different than the way that it's been described, sort of feels like the same mistake twice, sort of feels like one of those things that Georgia, would have to think long and hard about it. At least I would think of, this might just be the kind of, problem that's not easily corrected. What is your, and I hate to do the Monday morning quarterback thing about something that's not football, but what is your viewpoint on what we understand about the Rara Thomas situation here right now?
Well, my viewpoint is I appreciate the approach being case by case. And I think that's what the history of Georgia has proven is, we don't always lump guys into, well, we've seen this before. And for Rara, we have seen this before. We did see a similar occurrence last year. And when that happens, I think your response is different. I think you're looking to rehabilitate guys and try to give them opportunities. We understand that some folks are going to make mistakes, especially in this age group specifically, and they have unique opportunities to do that. And I heard your take on it, and I do think Rara's situation is different than the driving violations that seems to be recurring in Georgia. But again, this is a different set of circumstances. And I've listened to, I think a great clip comes from Nick Saban as he talks about Muhsin Muhammad when they were at Michigan State together. And many folks were calling for Coach Saban to release Muhammad, and he actually gave him a chance to come back and didn't dismiss him from the team. And he goes on to have a great, double-digit, over a decade career with the Panthers, was man of the year for a while. There is opportunity for some guys that they make mistakes and they learn from them and move on. In this particular case, I am of the camp that this isn't a one-time occurrence. And I don't know all the details. If I'm wrong, I will be the first to admit it and stand corrected once the details do come out. But this isn't something that I take lightly. You talk about family violence, especially with kids. That's not something that, it's a one-time occurrence. It happens. This shouldn't happen. This is not something that should be taken very lightly. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was a pretty extreme response once given that opportunity. And hearing that he's still incarcerated, I think obviously speaks to the way the judicial system is approaching this. And I would expect a pretty strong response from Georgia as well.
You said something a minute ago that I think is really important. I think really smart. You said that, you favor any kind of issue involving a football team handled on a case-by-case basis. I think that's really important and perhaps even more poignant than it maybe appears just at first blush, because if you've been a coach, and I know you have, and if you've been a teacher, I've certainly spent plenty of time around schools, you kind of understand that the notion of a zero-tolerance policy sometimes can be really problematic, even though it seems like the easiest thing in the world. We got a zero-tolerance policy, as it relates to fill in the blank, right? When you have a blanket policy that doesn't give respect to specific circumstances of an individual situation, it's how somebody ends up getting expelled from school because of a toy gun, or expelled from school because of a pencil that whatever. It's like when you take human decision making out of a situation, the outcome almost always ends up being worse. And so we're paying football coaches, whether it be Kirby or somebody else, we're paying them many millions of dollars, and obviously the kind of built-in assumption there is they're going to make tough, hard decisions, and they're going to do it with not always the most written rule book for what makes this situation similar, different than a previous situation. But that's what real leadership requires, is you've got to look at situations A compared to situation B, C, and D and say, this is why this is different than the others. But I think that's absolutely right that, there are some people out there that want to be really heavy-handed, not just about Georgia, but in any situation like this. There's always been a perch for the media to climb up on of, why is so-and-so not doing anything, about bad behavior? Well, the easiest way to make some of that kind of stuff go away is just say, hey, zero-tolerance policy from now on. Anybody who has any issue, they're out. They're out of here. But, man, that kind of stuff just invites all kinds of other problems on the other side of all of that. And I don't think that's what real leadership looks like. So I appreciate the fact that you mentioned the idea of viewing things on a case-by-case basis, Because that, to me, is what real leadership is.
Well, what's in the best interest? The best interest of that kid is, please look at my situation, the decisions that I've made, the mistakes that I've made, and judge me accordingly. In the best interest of the athletic department is to present this, hey, we've got this zero tolerance policy that makes us look better, but it comes to the detriment of the student athlete. I'll say this, it's not just Kirby Smart's decision with these players. Ultimately, he probably makes these decisions, but it's with the influence of other coaches. It's with the influence of the athletic department and the university as a whole. There is a standard that's being maintained across the board that in these situations, there are other voices that are going to be heard in the evaluation and the determination of bigger picture impact, not only for the school or the football team, but for the individual. And I think that's what we all ultimately would want if we were in that situation. When you recognize there's bigger problems or problems that may occur with regularity with players and student athletes, I think we heard from the SEC media days when Coach Smart's saying, we're bringing in outside resources. We understand that given the opportunity, the student athletes at the University of Georgia today have more opportunity to have faster cars that are more powerful, and that this can be seen as a problem. So what do? They're responding to that by bringing in experts and voices and people that these young men will listen to. Will every kid listen to the speaker that comes in? No, they won't. There'll still be decisions that are made that you think, oh, that was a boneheaded decision. Well, you're talking about a 19 or 20-year-old kid, specifically about the speeding and those type things. That happens across the country. What I also appreciate is Coach Smart said we're the only school that he knows of that dismissed a player because of it, that has suspended players because of it. Whether we like it or not, because of NIL deals, there is money involved now. And he more than alluded to, he said outright that it's hitting players in their pockets. So when there are mistakes made, there are ways to punish or impact or try to correct what I think is the ultimate hope for any program or any leadership position is we're trying to change behavior. We're trying to make sure that guys are making the right decision more often than not. And that seems to be in place. The numbers, I agree. You look at them from, if I just look at the numbers that, there's been 24 or 29 driving occurrences since the Devin Willock accident, that's troubling. But when you hear the steps that have been taken, the actions and response individually and specifically to each occurrence, that gives me comfort in knowing this isn't something that's being brushed under the rug. And that's sometimes the way it's being characterized is the University of Georgia, and specifically our football team, is we're overlooking some of these transgressions and prioritizing, we just want to win football games. That's not what's happening at the University of Georgia.
Can we speak about that a little bit more? Because, obviously, if I sort of express my opinion on this, but I think people care about hearing from you because you're a much, more significant stakeholder in all this than probably I am. When you see the national media types, when you see just randos on the internet, what's wrong with the culture at Georgia? Let's take that seriously for a moment. Is there a cultural issue at Georgia because of the fact that if you're just doing basic counting, there have been what seems like a significant number of arrests here over the course of the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's attention getting. It's the same thing that gets my attention when I see and this is social media driven, right? We've all seen that one meme or the one picture or Barstool Sports or some image that's listing the number of driving incidents since the Devin Willock unfortunate occurrence, right? Or the graduation rate. What you see these one pagers, and we live in a society that is headline driven. We're not digging into the meat behind it. And I think that's what matters most is don't worry about my opinion. Let's hear from Coach Smart and what he's doing. And what he is saying is we're aware that there seems to be this perception. He answered this specific question about the driving occurrences and said, we've brought in people, we've suspended people, it's players that they've been affected financially. We're taking all the steps. He believes in the culture in the locker room. I'm not in that locker room every day. He is. He knows the players that make up that team. So there's an outside perception and then there's reality. And until proven otherwise, I think that his finger that's on the pulse of what this team is about and the culture that's created and the opportunities that the coaching staff and the athletic department provides for the players and areas that they can improve. Until I have or hear something other than what's coming out from the horse's mouth, from the source itself, I'll back it. I'm a believer that there are mistakes, and I think this one specifically driving occurrences. One, there's more opportunity than there's ever has been because of the type car that you can purchase. I couldn't buy that car when I was 19, but I didn't have a six-figure NIL deal like most of the players that are in these bigger conferences, SEC, Big Ten. There are those opportunities, and because of a specific occurrence that happened with a Georgia player, and it was a loss of life situation, there is a microscope and a spotlight that's put on specifically driving related incidents. And Georgia's done itself no favors in this category, but I don't know of any other school that's tracking these things over the last year and a half, 2 years. Are you aware of any? I don't know of any of them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think that, and we don't know this because no one does this, but let's say we went to, a local high school or something like that, and we pulled at random 85 teenage boys, and we tracked them over the course of the next 4 years. The idea that somehow, 85 teenagers, men, males, tracked over the course of 4 years, the idea there wouldn't be any instances of anything from that population pulled at random over the course of 4 years. Well, that's just obviously not the case. John, you and I were teenagers. We were around, teenagers at the time. There is just going to be a certain level of kind of growing pains for young men during that time. And so, in this particular case, I don't know that a football team, be it Georgia or somewhere else, I don't know that it's really all, even though there's NIL money for faster cars and things like that, I actually don't know that the overall behavior for the average college football player is all that different than the overall behavior for the average teenage young man anyway.
Yeah, you might be right. I know this. There's plenty of fraternities on college campuses. I don't know of any report that is tracking and reporting in saying, of the 100 fraternity members that there were this many incidents that were related to fill in the blank. It's because Georgia is where it is. And I am all for holding the University of Georgia to the highest of standards across the board. I'm also for treating people responsibly. And I do feel like the University of Georgia is trying to do their very best to educate and provide resources to prevent folks from making bad choices, specifically in areas that we know might be problematic. And what we've seen is these driving occurrences might be a slippery slope or an opportunity for guys to get caught up and make mistakes. And so my question is, what's Georgia doing about it? Mm-hmm. And when you hear the answer, when you hear Coach Smart say, we're bringing in speakers, we're bringing in outside resources, we are dedicating time that we don't have to for our team as a whole to hear the message of why safe driving is important. I think that's a good message to send to these players. When I hear him say we're the only school that has dismissed players and suspended players that he knows of because of driving incidents, I think, all right, the response is appropriate. If it wasn't, then I'd have a much bigger issue with this hot topic item of Georgia is just allowing these players to race around Athens, and it's a dangerous scenario, not only for the players, but for the community. And Georgia's doing nothing about it. That's just not the case.
I think that's exactly right. I was going to talk to you about some regular football stuff, but we'll save that for next time. And hopefully, as we move towards the month of August, nothing but football ahead of what's going to be a fascinating season. John, your insight on stuff like this is always so valuable to us because you have such a sharp perspective. I really appreciate you sharing it. It's great to be back talking to you live again here on the program. And I'll look forward to many more, much more fun conversations in the weeks to come.
Well, welcome back, BA. You were missed. We did have a good time without you.
I heard that.
I'll say being with the whole crew was fun. And enjoyed it, but it's always great to have you back at the helm. So good to see you. Appreciate you having me on. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs. Right back to you, John. Appreciate that.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I heard so many great things about the content while I was gone. And as you know, I understand, it sort of makes me feel a little bit like a proud papa, to hear, hey, good stuff is happening while I'm not here. That means I'll just take more time. That was really, really happy to know that. And of course, John was a big part of all of that. Really, really good stuff. And I promise it's sort of nothing but fun for the rest of the show. We're done with any of that kind of stuff. Not that it's not a serious topic. That's fine. But at a certain point, everything that could be said has been. We sort of feel like we have. And so it's kind of nothing, including, by the way, in a minute, a Georgia football player in a way that you maybe would never expect to see him. We'll do that here coming up in just a little bit. Prior to that, though, let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, many of you know, and we'll have more on this in a moment, that I was away from work for two different reasons over the course of the last couple of weeks. Most recently was because of a baseball tournament with my son. We'll talk about that here coming up in a moment. But the first week, I was on board Utopia of the Seas. And you'll never understand what an incredible privilege this is for me to be invited to be kind of a part of, sort of a preview sailing before the ship really set sail for the passengers and things like that. And it was especially fun for me this time around because this is also the same ship we're going to be on for our DawgNation cruise coming up in April of 2025. So I was so excited about all of it. And I think for me, I would say every time I go on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, there's probably a special takeaway I have from any of those. I think for me, the takeaway from this year's experience on board Utopia of the Seas was simply this. Like, we have had so much going on in the life of our family lately. A lot of folks feel that way. You kind of have these things pop up. And so, one of the things that Utopia of the Seas is going to be, because of where it's stationed, Port Canaveral, because of what it's offering, the sort of 3 and the 4 night cruises, they're sort of celebrating this as like the world's biggest weekend, right? You want the weekend party, you want the fun, long weekend experience, or the 4 night sailing, which is a little bit more easy to budget with your time than perhaps a 7-night cruise would be. That's sort of what Utopia of the Seas is all about. And so for my wife and me who had a chance to be on board Utopia of the Seas, that's definitely what we use this for. It was just it was over the course of weekdays, but kind of like that great long weekend experience. And for she and I both, we just needed a break from it all. We needed to get away from some of the serious stuff we have going on and just relax for a little bit, have some fun. And we're in kind of a stage of our life where we're not going out and, on the town a lot on the weekends, things like that. We have young kids. We have a hard time doing that. But Utopia of the Seas gives you a chance to have that experience. For us, two, I would say, venues on board in particular gave us that chance. There's a music hall where there's a great rock band that plays, and we're kind of, I'm not a great dancer, but I'll get on the dance floor with her a little bit. We'll have some fun doing that. There's also the Mason Jar, which is just such a fun thing where, you've got Southern-themed food in the restaurant. You've got a lot of bourbon-style cocktails with the bar, and a great country band that's sort of playing late into the night. She and I are not staying out late a lot in our regular life right now, but we'll be up to 2 in the morning on the ship, enjoying the music and having some fun at the Mason Jar. Some of the staff there in the bar would kind of be a part of the show. They'd get up there and start singing and dancing, and it's just one of those things that on land we don't get that experience at times. But the folks on board Utopia of the Seas give us that experience while we're on sea, which is one of the reasons we keep going back to Royal Caribbean cruises over and over and over again. I can promise you this. I've already got one trip on Utopia of the Seas booked for April, obviously our DawgNation cruise, but I can't wait to get everybody in my family back for the world's biggest weekend coming up very soon there as well. It was everything I hoped it could be. And Jessica Slater, a terrific travel agent, specially selected for us by Royal Caribbean, she can make sure your experience is just as good there as well. So please give her a call, 770-718-9147, 770-718-9147. You can also email her at jslater at dreamvacations.com, Jay Slater at dreamvacations.com. We want to see you in April for our Dog Nation cruise. We've sold so many staterooms for that already. But you don't have to wait till next April to be on board Utopia the Seas. In fact, I hope you'll think about it as we head towards the holidays or early 2025. Man, the entire crew and the entire staff there at Royal Caribbean just made this a wonderful, wonderful experience for all of us. All right, let's transition to cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. This is a small thing that perhaps means more to me than it does to some. Many of you knew that Georgia, based on some actions over the course of the last couple of weeks, was in search of another support staffer. Mark Robinson being brought in, sort of a chief of staff type guy, director of football ops type guy. What's interesting about this from Robinson was he was a recent hire of Billy Napier as recently as January. And obviously we love any chance that Georgia has to sort of flex on Florida. That's always a lot of fun. But don't discount this here for a moment. What we're looking at is a couple of different things. We're looking at, as I've kind of mentioned in previous weeks, evidence that Georgia is just still Georgia and as much in control of the situation as they always are, or yanking a staffer like this from Florida this late in the process, certainly an example of that. And if you are, the lousy, stinking Gators, your recruiting ranking right now is pretty dismal. The fact that you can't even hold on to staffers you just hired, the fact that Florida right now does not have that look, that view of a destination job. I think it speaks to the challenge awaiting Billy Napier here in this sort of kind of put up or shut up type year at Florida, where they're playing, as we've documented, maybe the toughest schedule anyone's ever played. And the fact of the matter is, Florida could be a not terrible team and still have a terrible record because of the schedule they're playing. And I would say that the overall kind of vibe around Florida is probably as low as it's been. And I count this at any time in the Dan Mullen era, perhaps the Jim McElwain era too. This is just a really low vibe right now for Florida. They're not winning recruiting battles. They're not holding on to staffers. They're staring at a schedule where wins going to be really, really hard to come by. And you sort of wonder if this is a program that is just sort of doomed for another reboot here. The Robinson news, perhaps an example of that. Of course, the great support staff that Georgia puts together make recruiting wins more possible, and Georgia could be on the verge of one of those here very soon. The recruit that we've kind of called perhaps the most important of all for Georgia in the 2025 class is Elijah Griffin, the defensive lineman out of Pooler, Georgia. Sometimes people say Savannah, but Griffin wants folks to know it's Pooler that he's from, which is essentially right there in the same area. Well, he has put out his list of finalists right now. Georgia obviously makes the cut. USC does there as well. You sort of wonder how much of a glutton for punishment USC actually is. Are they going to really try to do battle with Georgia for another prospect like this? You sort of wonder about that. And the third team in the mix here is Miami. Obviously, this is one that Georgia really wants to win, and the possibility of pairing him with Justice Terry as defensive tackles, and also a guy like the young man from Warner Robins that Georgia brought in the other day. The chance of Georgia putting together this haul along the defensive front, man, it just has a chance to be a remarkable success story of this 2025 class. Griffin, one of the biggest names of all, will be watching that closely. Something that got a lot of attention a few days ago was what Matt Rhule said, and there's been a lot of sort of clap back on him and a little clap back against the clap back and all that kind of stuff about Matt Rhule's belief that the Big Ten deserves 4 teams in the college football playoff because he says it's the best league in college football. The other thing, though, that Rhule said in all of this, which I don't think should get lost, is the notion that the Big Ten is now a national league. And it's the closest thing that college football has to being the NFL because of the fact that the league stretches nationally. What I want you to notice about this is I want you to notice that this is the argument you're going to start hearing a lot more from the Big Ten in the future. I know they have the reigning national champion, obviously, in Michigan, but we also know that on the field, the Big Ten just historically has not matched up very well with the SEC, many such cases of that being true. So you got to try to find something new to spin, something new to sell. And I do believe that's what they're going to try to sell. The idea that the SEC is the sort of regional league and the Big Ten is the sort of national league. Now, how far you stretch geographically has nothing to do with the quality of your football, but I do believe that's what they're going to try to sell, and maybe Matt Rhule the other day was an example of that. One more story here just for a moment. Saw where Dabo Swinney, who's as much of a traditionalist as exists in college football, was sort of railing on some of the changes coming to the roster things and the possibility that might eliminate what we kind of think of as walk-ons. Obviously, that's what Dabo was at Alabama. He sort of leaned on his personal experience to talk about this. And you're perhaps not surprised by Dabo Swinney saying any of that. I think the one thing, though, to keep in mind about all of this change that's taking place and the so-called scholarship expansion that exists for other sports and also perhaps for football there too, well, I'm sure see Georgia utilize some of that to its advantage. Maybe we'll have to never worry about roster limits and things like that moving forward. But I think it's important to note that a little bit like in 2020 when they granted the extra year of eligibility but made no concession to the schools for that, the allowance for more scholarships does not mean that there will actually be all that, more scholarships either in college football or college athletics overall. So whether it be Dabo railing on this or other people sort of speaking out, that some of what the NCAA says it wants to do, college athletics says it wants to do in light of the House settlement stuff that kind of became official on Friday evening, what actually does get implemented from that, I think still remains to be seen. And how all of this sort of fits into the college landscape, what's good, what's not, I think that's to be determined there as well. So interesting to see Dabo Swinney kind of once again sort of speaking out against all of that. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And while I have a moment before I show you something fun as it relates to a Georgia football player, let me give a shout out to our friends at Precision Garage Doors. We talk about 5-star recruits here on the program. Well, Precision Garage Door has a 5-star reputation for service. They've earned this over and over again by taking good care of folks. So if you need a garage door replaced or you just need simple repair work on the garage door you already have, our friends at Precision Garage Door, the name to know they're on that. There's a $29 service fee, but it gets waived anytime you get some repair work done. So I want you to reach out to our friends Precision Garage Door. They're a neighborly company, and they'll take good care of you. Get your quote today. It's precisiondoorgeorgia.com. That is precisiondoorgeorgia.com for more on that. All right, let's have some fun here for a moment. If you're watching on video, I'll describe this to you. Warren Brinson, Georgia defensive lineman, shared this on his social media accounts here over the course of the last couple of days. How about the idea of Brinson taking flight? He says, I flew a plane. Now, for those of you who've ever done anything like this, these cockpits for these planes are pretty small. You can sort of see Brinson, if you're watching, his knees are already right all the way in kind of the console as it is. This is a prop plane. It's got propellers in the front here. And if you've ever flown anything like this, I have flown in a small plane like this. They're really very small, not just in terms of like your comfort, but also it's just a little bit weird to be in the air in something so small. But Brinson seems to be as cool as a cucumber in all of this. I'm sure that's an amazing feeling, and good for him for enjoying some of that, maybe kind of the final moments of his off-season spent in the air there, flying a plane. He says it was an item off his bucket list, so congratulations for Warren Brinson to be able to do that, and a good video being shared there as well. So fun stuff there from Warren Brinson on that. Of course, fulfilling your bucket list items, that's something that Brinson's getting a chance to do there. Many of you thinking about that when it comes to your retirement. Our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners want to make all of that possible for you there, too. Doing those fun things you've been looking forward to with the peace of mind, knowing that your money is well taken care of. Our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners offer a truly free, no-obligation retirement planning service, which includes no upfront risk to you. You can know that financial security truly is possible, and you can generate up to 50% more retirement income at a fraction of the cost that you might have to pay to somebody else. You don't ever have to worry about outliving your retirement savings. They take care of you, all that. They can accurately predict what your retirement income is going to be even 20 years in the future. So I want you to reach out to them and find them today. It's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. That is GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. Great to have them, of course, as a part of DawgNation Daily. So self-serving today, if you don't mind, for our golden shoe. I got some great submissions from all of you while I was gone, and I promise we will get back to those. But many of you know, in addition to being on Utopia of the Seas, last week we spent some time in Cooperstown, New York, for the Cooperstown Dreams baseball tournament. You may have heard Kirby Smart also mention that for his own son. He was up there as well. Got to give a shout-out to my son, Charlie. We had a little bit of a harrowing experience. Our travel situation was horrible. Charlie also got a little sick when we got there. But on the very first swing he took while at Cooperstown, you see the picture of that there on the left. You also see me coaching at first there, too. Very first swing he took at Cooperstown, he sent it over the center field wall. He got the baseball for that. That's kind of a big part of the tradition there and all of that. And my daughter, Kate, went and retrieved the baseball for Charlie. She got very good at retrieving balls while she was there. So congratulations to Charlie. Thanks for the help from Kate getting the ball back. Special moment for our family. Golden shoes going to us for a change there on all of that. A really, really fun week, and I wanted to give you an update there on that. How about lousy, stinking Gators? They got no home run balls. They got nothing of happiness to celebrate. It's just simply been 1,360 days of misery for them. Long time since they've beaten Georgia, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. Y'all have a great day. That is our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see you back here tomorrow, and it feels good to be able to say that on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cooldown. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right. So I said this to our audience before we started the show here today, and I'm going to tell you this here right now. So we are back live. This is a real show. And if you want to take that down, you can. We're back here live, and we're doing this. This is obviously a real show. But at the same time, I've got like all kinds of weird stuff going on away from work, and I apologize for that. Got like one day of sort of weirdness here today, and then tomorrow we're going to come back, and I promise we'll roll through a whole bunch of comments and things like that. So I'm so ready to get back to your comments, so ready to talk to all of you, weighing in on the Rara thing or anything else going on in Georgia football. But I got to beg your forgiveness here today. I've got to step away from work here just for a little bit to take care of something that's got nothing to do with work, and I apologize for that. So let me just give a shout out to our friends at R.S. Andrews, and I promise you we'll do an extra long comment section tomorrow. I totally promise you on that. But, you know, it's hot weather. You know, you want to stay cool on the inside of your house while all that's going on. Our friends at R.S. Andrews got you covered for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. Right now you're thinking a lot about that AC unit. So let them take care of you on all of that. I promise they'll do good stuff for you. Keep you cool and comfortable all summer long. They're all about that. So find them online there at rsandrews.com. They will take care of you. And then tomorrow, I promise you, a bunch of comments. We'll do it all like normal. We'll get back to it, but I need to beg your forgiveness here today. So y'all check out R.S. Andrews, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.